Well, good evening. I'm Nick Cater, Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. Thank you. Welcome to a very special occasion, a book launch which normally we do in the flesh, but books are an essential part of life in Australia and book launches must go on. Tonight, we're going to talk a bit about Robert Menzies. Robert Menzies was the intellectual founder of what is arguably the most successful conservative democratic movement in the post-war world. The Liberal Party of Australia began with a set of values that were clearly articulated time after time by Menzies. The Menzies Research Centre is committed to promoting a better understanding of that intellectual inheritance in the belief that it should provide the reference point for tackling the public policy challenges of today. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join with us to celebrate the latest milestone in this Robert Menzies legacy project. God and Menzies by David Furse-Roberts focuses on an aspect of Menzies' moral character that's frequently overlooked, his faith. The book charts the influence of how the Christian faith had on Menzies, how it became embedded in the Liberal Party philosophy of the party he formed. And this is an important book for two reasons. First, because it demonstrates the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition on Australia and on our liberal democracy and civil society. Second, because it challenges one of the most dangerous myths of our time, that faith-based morality has no place in politics or civic debate and should be banished from the public square. At a time when freedom of religion seems constantly under threat, this book argues the case for God in secular society. Well, later I'll be giving the floor to the author David Furse-Roberts, Senior Research Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre. I'll also be welcoming formally some of our VIP guests here tonight. We've got a terrific roll-up tonight, and it will, in a way, it's just as well. It's not a live event because we couldn't have fitted you all in the room. If you've got any questions or comments to contribute, please use the comments section on the Zoom page to make a note of them, and we'll come back to them later. There's many people to thank for this book. David will be, and I'll be acknowledging them later. But as the publisher, I first want to recognise the two other writers in this book. Prime Minister Scott Morrison contributed a very thoughtful foreword for which we thank him, and I highly recommend it for your reading. And second, I want to thank a former Deputy Prime Minister, the Hon John Anderson AO, for contributing an afterword that reinforces and amplifies the key messages. And I'm delighted that John Anderson is able to join us tonight from northern New South Wales and honour us by launching David Furse-Roberts' God and Menzies, the faith that shaped the Prime Minister and his nation. John Anderson.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and to you, the author of the book that we're celebrating now, David Furse-Roberts, former Prime Minister John Howard, and friends, one and all. I'm coming to you tonight from Southwest Rocks. We've been allowed out of lockdown for a little while, which is great. So we're snatching a few days away. Now, I'm not quite my home environment, but it's a great honour to launch this. And I think it's an important work. It's a rare thing, a detailed, well-sourced and well-argued, well-reasoned, fair and balanced, I would say, account of the things that our longest serving and in many ways most influential Prime Minister believed in. I've long felt that beliefs are underestimated in terms of their role in society. Beliefs drive values, it seems to me, and values in turn influence people's behaviour, ethics, and in the case of politics, their policies. Menzies, as an outward-looking man, again, something that we forget, he was a true global statesman, would have understood the enormous influence of beliefs, I think, as he looked at the world around him. And indeed, today, it's worth reflecting that there are something like 190 countries across the world. Only 40 are what you could really call democracies, and many of them are now dubious and seem to lack conviction in their own foundational beliefs and values anyway, perhaps even ours included. And all of those 40s, with 4 exceptions, essentially were Christian countries. The four exceptions were deeply, or have been deeply influenced by Christianity and by the West. I would include in those four India, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So Menzies, at that helicopter level, if I can use that word, would have looked at the world and recognised beliefs play out, not just in our lives, but in the sort of societies that we come to live in.
Yeah. Where will I see the comments?
Now, if I could, conversely, the lack of beliefs, the breakdown in the great sort in our own country, I think, has led to a very real problem. So it's hard to find a conservative who knows what to conserve anymore. Liberals seem to believe in big government and a lot of interference, or a lot of them do. And the old democratic socialists or left-wing, left of centre movements appear to have moved to a new sort of obsession with victimhood politics. And this is a problem because that lack of belief and vision gives way to ad hocery and managerialism of a sort that's not very satisfying and robs us of the opportunity to test policies against their long-term impact on the sort of country that we want to be in the public debate. Menzies was, I think it's fair to say, massively shaped. It emerges through this work by the home he grew up in, his deep knowledge of the Christian Bible, as well as his astute powers of observation. Greg Sheridan, in his latest book, talks about how the Apostle Paul changed the way we think. He introduced the concept of universalism. Consider that extraordinary statement. We are no longer man nor woman, slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, but all one in Jesus Christ. That concept of universalism was to show up in one of the most interesting things to my way of thinking that Menzies ever said, when he commented that democracy is not like a machine, it's more a spirit in which, regardless of our abilities and station in life, all souls must be regarded as equal in the sight of heaven. That's a profound doctrine. It's the real answer to racism. It's an interesting point, I think, that Menzies would have understood, someone he would have seen probably from the other side of politics, Martin Luther King, when he talked about character being more important than the colour of skin. And he'd have had little time for the horrors of what we now call identity politics, and particularly its high watermark of intersectionality, where the more identity sort of features you can accumulate, the more of a victim you are, and the more you must be somehow or other celebrated as a victim. He wouldn't have understood that. He would have said, no, universalism, love your neighbour, do as you ought to others, and be stout, be strong in it, was a much better answer to things, horrors such as racism, than, if I may say so, Black Lives Matter and movements like that are so easily captured and have been by activists and identity politics players. He'd have, I think, too, understood and did at the time the huge dangers of communism and the way it now threatens us. It's a form of religion, in my view. Atheistic, yes, but it preaches a nirvana. The end state of history will be a Marxist utopia, and brooks no opposition to the idea of domination by the party. He would have, I think, been horrified at our lack of conviction in the West today when we're confronted by massive conviction on the part of those who dislike, even loathe our way of life and want us to live according to very different dictates. It all stems from that recognition of the dignity and the worth of the individual that he, is pronounced by a higher authority. He plainly accepted that and saw it as incredibly important, foundational to what he might have called, along with Churchill, civilizational Christianity. So I think this is a very valuable book. David, I think you've done an incredible job in pulling together some really interesting material. In an age when, as Nick said, we want to push beliefs out of the public square, I have to say that I think this is very dangerous. I think it's a nonsense. We should be very careful of what we're wishing for, because we are confronted by people who have very powerful belief systems, and we need to know what we believe. And we need to be really careful about, as I said a moment ago, what it is that we're wishing for. You've put together a compelling case, I think, for us to consider, which is that our longest serving, and most many ways nation-shaping Prime Minister really did have a core set of beliefs. He may not have always talked about them publicly. He may not have fitted perhaps the mould that his own parents, with their very strong Methodism on one side, Presbyterian background on the other side. He always identified as a Presbyterian rather than as a Methodist. But all of those things played out very strongly. He was a huge admirer of John Wesley, for example, saw him as one of the great men, if not the greatest of the 18th century. And so he understood so deeply, and you bring it to life, the importance of a Christian worldview to the sustaining of freedom and of democracy. And I do think that you're to be commended for what you've done. I think it's tremendous that so many people have turned up for tonight. I commend the book to you. I think it'll make a great thing to do, to go out and buy several copies of it and give them away as Christmas presents. Thank you very much, David. And I do hope it moves very well, because it deserves to. It's an important work.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you very much for those fine words. Thank you very much indeed for honouring us with your presence today. Just before we move on to the author himself, just a few words of housekeeping. First of all, the QR code. You don't have to check in to come onto this show in the usual manner, but that QR code will take you through to our web site, to the Menzies Research Centre site, where you can order the book. So if you click on that, that should take you straight through to the book ordering page. Order your copy of either the hardback or the softback, and we'll get it off to you just as soon as Australia Post can oblige. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we do welcome your comments and questions. I think at the bottom of your Zoom page, you should see Q&A. Press on there rather than chat if you can, and put your questions in there, and we'll get to those later. There are many people I need to welcome here. So many of you, friends of the Menzies Research Centre, friends of David, supporters of David, people who've helped on the book. Thank you, one and all. May I particularly thank the Honourable John Howard for joining us this evening, and thank you, Mr. Howard, for your support for this project. I know you've been a great backer. To John Anderson, we've already heard from. Paul Ritchie from the Prime Minister's office has been a terrific help on this, helping us through and helping us get this book through. We're also joined by Women's Committee President Mary Lou Jarvis, Robin Nolan, Federal Women's Committee President, and Mary Lou Jarvis from the New South Wales Women's Council. Very important person joining us today is Georgina Downer. She's the Executive Director of the Robert Menzies Institute, which you know that we established, the Menzies Research Centre established in partnership with the University of Melbourne. It's going to be a permanent home to celebrate and to study and to consider the Menzies legacy. It's a tremendous achievement. It's been many years in the making, as many of you know, and many of you have been very generous in supporting that, and it opens in November. Tanya Davis MP, Senator Erica Betts, Senator David Fawcett, Rowan Ramsey, Neil Angus, Tony Passin MP, George Christensen MP, Peter Kane MLA, Tony McClelland. Tony and Ray McClelland have been great supporters of this book financially, and thank you very much, Tony and Ray, particularly for your support for this book. Christian Jenkins, my opposite number from the Page Research Centre. Alec Menzies, a member of the Menzies family. Welcome, Alex. And MRC directors Mitch Hook, Paul Espy. I told you there was a lot. Dr. David Kemp, author of that fantastic 4-volume series which we've been putting out. And finally, two finalies. Finally, for this section, Heather Henderson, daughter of the great Robert Menzies. Welcome, Heather, and thank you for your support for this book. And to David Furse-Roberts' parents, Christine and Barton. So now I think comes a moment when I hand the floor over to the author. Thank you, David, for this book. It's a very important contribution you've made to the growing canon of literature on Menzies, and for the reasons I said earlier, particularly important. David Furse-Roberts, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you, John, for that incredibly thoughtful and generous introduction. A very warm welcome to you all tonight. I wish I could greet each of you in person, but an opportunity for that will come shortly. Well, it was my great pleasure to have written God Menzies, and I am so grateful for the wonderful, sustained, generous support from so many of you that made this project possible. So with this book, the great question is, what spiritually made our longest serving Prime Minister tick? Well, in his own faith, Menzies was essentially an old school broad church Presbyterian who cherished the Scottish heritage of his church. As the son of a Presbyterian turned Methodist preacher, his faith also lived and breathed the spirit of John Wesley, whom he revered for bringing life into the English church. To be sure, Menzies' own form of Christianity was not deeply theological, but broad, and in its breadth, it resembled the mere Christianity of C.S. Lewis, with the Bible as its basic source. From his family background and the ministry of the evangelical preacher, C.H. Nash, Menzies inherited a great love of Scripture, which he described in 1960 as the great repository of our faith and inspiration. Added to this, his youthful faith was shaped by the socially engaged Protestantism of the Melbourne University Christian Union, which affirmed the importance of serving in public life to contribute to the common good. The interdenominational nature of this union also furnished Menzies with a very broad ecumenical Christianity that transcended sectarian divisions. As Prime Minister, Menzies felt equally at home in all church circles, whether at a Presbyterian or Methodist church service, a Salvation Army citizens rally, or a Catholic gala dinner. In 1963, he remarked that whatever branch of the Christian church we may happen to belong to, we must all thank God that the work of the church goes on. Esteeming the Old Testament roots of Christianity, Menzies admired the Jewish tradition and its tremendous contribution to Australia and the world. As Prime Minister, Menzies enjoyed an excellent rapport with Australia's Jewish community, frequently attending their functions, standing with them in opposition to anti-Semitism, welcoming Jewish refugees from post-war Europe, and also standing firm with the great nation of Israel. Menzies affirmed religious freedom for believers and non-believers alike, the freedom to pray, to worship, to assemble, and to practice one's own religious credo without interference was a great pillar of a free and civilized society. For Menzies, freedom did not exist in a moral vacuum or a spiritual void. A truly free society was as much about responsibilities as it was about rights. And Menzies credited religious faith for giving people a sensitive understanding of their human obligations. In a civilized community, he said, not one of us can live to himself. In the immortal words of St. Paul, we are members one of another. My freedom must be limited if I am to live at peace with my neighbor and his or her freedom. The French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville once said that freedom cannot be established without virtue, and virtue cannot be established without faith. Which is faith in something greater than ourselves? Now, for Menzies, this faith was not in the utopian dream of communism, nor in selfish consumerism, nor in any brand of identity politics, but in what he described in 1955 as the old yet new evangel of Christ. For Menzies and for millions of Australians, this message of new life has been the fountainhead of enduring beliefs, his affirmation of human freedom and individual dignity, faith, neighbourly love, character, civility, honest work, family, community, and justice for all remain the guarantor of a good life for people of all creeds. May his ideals and the faith that nurtured them be an inspiration to you all. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for those words. And we'll go now to some questions and comments from the audience. We've had a number of people respond, some quite feisty questions, I have to say, which I'm sure David and John will do their best to answer. Just a reminder again that you can buy the book online, you clicking that QR code or just going to our website, www.menziesrc.org, and we'll get it to you just as soon as Australia Post allows. First, a question, if I may throw a question out and ask you both to respond, John and David, briefly. I made the statement at the beginning that the importance of the book is that you, by tracing the Christian influence on Menzies, that Judeo-Christian influence goes through to the party he founded. To what extent is that true? Have I overstated it? Or can we see in the liberal tradition evidence of things like love thy neighbour as thyself, I am my brother's keeper? David, do you want to answer that briefly, and then we'll go to John?
Yes, certainly. Well, the Liberal Party, of course, was conceived not as a confessional Christian party, but as a secular, non-ecclesiastical party, which would have no attachment to any churches. But that said, it drew from a richly Christian tradition, which is embedded in our own tradition of liberalism. And it was also the product of a post-war humanitarian liberalism that emerged in the Western world as a corrective, if you like, to the horrors of both communism and fascism. And it remained heavily imbued with Christian ideals, and as such, it resonated with both traditional Protestant values and also Catholic social teaching. And so it appealed to a broad cross-section of Christians, Jews, and others of religious faith, and also those of no faith who believe in basic human values.
John, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, not a great deal. I think I'd just say that we live in an age, as I mentioned, ad hocery and managerialism, and my people perish for want of a vision. I think there's a lack of clarity in all of the political parties about their core philosophical base or bases. I don't think any party can be excused from that. And you're seeing some quite vigorous if you like, debate over where the real soul of each of these parties lie. Well, the beauty of this book is that it reminds us, that's why I threw in that reference, where do you find democracy and freedom? The reality is you can't get away from it. You find it in the countries that had Christian origins. Then go and have a look at the alternatives. As Churchill said, for all of its faults, the alternatives are not very attractive. Now, at the heart, in my view, of a functioning democracy is not this idea that we're now getting fed through critical race theory and what have you, that quotas are the answer to everything because, you know, only whites are racist and what have you. It's that universalism that Greg Sheridan sort of says was the product of the Apostle Paul changing the way we think. He really grasped that in a very deep way. And I don't think we ought to lose it. And anybody who's really, you know, there's another Menzies who's written a very interesting book more recently about on what basis do we value every individual. We've got to break away from this idea of equal outcomes and recognise that's not the issue. Equal value is the idea, and where does it come from? Well, we find very hard to find a rational basis for it. Menzies found it plainly. It was informed by his faith, as I referred to. And I think without that in principle, it's very hard to keep the idea that we're all equal under the law, common law applies to the king as well as to the most humble peasant and so forth, which is critical to the proper functioning of a society like ours and is the antidote to this never-ending fractionalisation of our communities, this tribalisation, this polarisation, and the results of it, which are unbelievable levels of anxiety, of depression, of self-harm amongst our young people. We need to ask ourselves some hard questions, and as I said earlier, we should be very careful about what we wish for.
Thank you, David. There's one here, I think, for you from Stuart Roberts. How did Menzies' time in the political wilderness in the 1940s affect his faith?
Well, thank you, Stuart. His time in the political wilderness was really from the early to mid 1940s, before the centre-right of Australian politics regrouped to form the Liberal Party out of the remnants of the old United Australia Party. And so in that time, Menzies had an opportunity to muse on his own political philosophy and to articulate a new liberalism. And he did so in a series of several speeches, which were compiled in a volume called The Forgotten Speeches, Studies in Australian Democracy. And the most famous of that speech was his Forgotten People speech, which he gave on the 27th of May, 1942. And in that speech, we see Menzies really sort of articulating sort of a traditional sort of Protestant values shaped by Calvinism. And also he has a famous line that human nature is at its greatest when it combines independence of man with dependence on God. And that sort of in a nutshell encapsulated his worldview.
Mary Lou Jarvis has sent a question. It's a moral conundrum which I've been pondering. I'm sure I'm not the only one. Let me read it to you, and then I might start with you, John. The question is, what do you think Menzies would have to say about the need to vaccinate? And then Mary Lou very considerately gives us the two moral arguments here, I guess, which are somehow in tension. Would he say that we have a duty to protect all souls, and with that right comes responsibilities to others? I.e., do we look after our responsibility to our responsibility to others primarily, or secondly, should we enjoy freedom of choice, minimal interference from government, and basically be allowed to make our own decisions? John.
I'm very reluctant to, try and put retrospectively somehow words into or thoughts into his hand. But let me have a stab. I think he would have recognised and promoted very much the idea that we have a duty to our neighbour, and that we ought to be prepared to put aside hesitation wherever possible. And be vaccinated. I think he would have argued that, but he would also, and we've been weak on this in Australia, allowed properly for conscientious objection. Think of the movie Hacksaw Ridge. In the darkest days of World War II, the Allies wondering whether they'd even win the war and preserve freedom for their country, still allowed for conscientious objection. They made the terms pretty hard. You had to argue the case. You had to be able to demonstrate you had genuine reasons for not doing so. But no free society that denies conscience in the end remains free. Surely freedom of conscience, which carries with it the right to act in accordance with your beliefs and your conscience, is the first and foremost freedom of a democracy like ours. And I think he would have recognised that at the same time as he would have encouraged people as so many of our better leaders at the moment are doing, to seek vaccination in the interest of loving your neighbour. That universalism that I meant to mention, and I know David has, led him to argue so strongly for the end of the sectarian pressures and divisions in Australia. Think of your neighbour, respect the other person, because a higher authority has said their soul matters as much as yours. That was the language he used.
David, in this book and also in the previous book we published, In His Own Words, that's a book of Menzies quotations, when I read it, it comes home to me time and time again that whenever Menzies talks about freedom, he always goes on to talk about duty. It's generally the word he uses. I guess we talk more about responsibility these days. Those things appear to be inextricably linked in Menzies' mind. Is there a Christian origin to that?
Well, yes, certainly. It's a Christian origin, I guess, that has origins both in Scripture and in the tradition of natural law, which is based on Scripture, but also developed by theologians, most notably Thomas Aquinas. And it's a belief essentially that God does endow us with natural rights, the rights to life, to property, and to freedom. And many of these, of course, were articulated in the American Declaration of Independence and in the Federalist Papers of America's early founding. To a large degree, they also draw on Enlightenment liberal thought as well. And so, yes, they do have that origin that if God creates us in his image, he creates us with freedom, but he also creates everyone else with freedom. And somehow the freedom of one person has to be balanced with the freedom of another person. And because, as Paul, the apostle, reminds us, we are members of one another, as Menzies himself reiterated, we have to be mindful that one person's right will also be another person's duty. And so we are interconnected in that way through a thread of reciprocal rights and duties, or freedoms and obligations.
I must admit, I'm reading the questions and comments. I'm very impressed with the sort of degree of engagement with deep theological ideas. Paul Lindwell throws out one, which actually came to me, David, as I was reading your book. I was wondering this too. He points out that Presbyterians tend to follow Calvin, it's Calvinism. And Calvinism, of course, is about predestination. It's about you have a destiny. But of course, that impacts with the idea of individual autonomy and freedom. Can you, without getting into too deep theological waters, how do you resolve those two things about Presbyterianism, which was, as you write, along with Methodism, a key part of his upbringing?
Yes, well, in my book, I say that Menzies was indebted to both Presbyterianism and Methodism. It's true to say that although Menzies imbibed a lot of Presbyterian emphases, namely that on the sovereignty of God over all spheres of life, and also the sense of divine calling, that whatever occupation or endeavor you have in life, it is all done to the glory of God. But on the other hand, he was not necessarily a strict Calvinist. I think that he would have been uncomfortable with the notion of limited atonement when it comes to salvation, and also with predestination. I think that his theological views were probably more universalist than those of a Calvinist stream of thinking. And I think he was also heavily indebted to Methodism, with its great belief in human progress under God. So the idea that by God's grace, people, with the help of the Holy Spirit, can become more holy, as Christians say, which means becoming more like Christ, more like God. And Wesley and the Methodists taught that under God's grace, human beings have the free will to be able to become more like Christ. And they have the free will either to follow him or to reject him.
Well, probably worth noting, if I could just add, I would have thought that by the time Menzies was growing up, the scholarship to Wesley and what have you, Presbyterianism had moved closer in that sense to Wesleyanism, well, Methodism, and emphasising that sort of aspect of choice. I think that'd be a fair general observation.
Yes, indeed. You're very right, John. Yeah.
Just in adding to that theme, in Presbyterianism, of course, is deeply associated with the Scots. Your ancestry, John, they contributed so much to Australia in the 19th century. So much of the energy and hard work that helped, turn Australia into a productive farming country came from Scots. Even our industrial base came from Scots. Hugh Mackay, of course, invented the Sunshine Harvester. At one stage, it was the biggest production line in the Commonwealth. So these were all Scots. I could go on. Robert Menzies, of course. We think about Rupert Murdoch, and yourself, John. Why is it? Do you think that there's something in the Scottish spirit, in the Scottish culture, that possibly comes through Presbyterianism? This sort of instinct to work out your own salvation, Protestant work ethic, if you like. Do you think that that is something that is real and unique? And if so, has Australia been very fortunate to have had so many people from the Scottish heritage in those early days of settlement?
What was the old saying? The British gave Australia governance, the Scots gave it an economy, and the Irish did the work. But actually, the Scots worked pretty hard too. Look, I do think there's a great deal. You said that, my very sort of opening remarks were about the importance of beliefs. And it's worth noting that the influence of John Knox, which is sometimes so roundly criticised, it's very easy to look to the upside. The emphasis on learning, on teaching children to read and to write, largely so they can understand their Bible, I suppose, led to, in one of the times when it existed, the Scottish Parliament in 1698, passing legislation ensuring that all Scottish children were to be offered an education. And the result was dynamic. It was extraordinary. Scots who came from a land that was pretty harsh and unforgiving, riven by difficulties and strife, started to settle down, cooperate, learn. They became leaders in a whole range of fields. British literacy and numeracy, hope I don't offend anybody here, did not catch up with Scottish levels for 200 years, 1898. And so you had this great mercantile spirit. The Scots, they're always careful with buck. They're not bad at making it either. They know how to thrive in tough circumstances. There are those characteristics. But the influence of Protestantism in Scotland, ending the internal strife, a whole lot of other issues, leading to great learning. My own family, my great-great-grandfather was a Glasgow-educated doctor who went into the army and then came to Australia. At the time that he came to Australia, at St Guy's Hospital, I think was the biggest in Britain, if not the world, there were 400 visiting fellows there. 300 of them had not been educated in England or on the continent. They'd been educated in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen. So I think the influence there, you can trace it all back to the extraordinary revolution that was really wrought in Scotland by the coming of Protestantism. So the answer to your question is yes, I think it was profoundly impactful, but I think belief systems are everywhere you go, for good or for ill.
bottom of the page. This is the launch of David Furse-Roberts' God Menzies. I'm Nick Cater. We're with David Furse-Roberts and John Anderson, just discussing some issues in the book raised by you in your questions. I'm not going to get through them all, I must say, before 7:30, but David and I are recording a podcast later this week, which we hope to have out very soon. So a lot of these questions, I think we can incorporate into that discussion. David, Rick Umbach, our good friend, writes, could you please give us an example of a major policy decision made by Menzies in which his faith can be shown to have had an influence? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Rick. There are a number of policy issues, I think, that shape that. I can just briefly skirt over a few. Even his support of the post-war immigration scheme, which has given due credit to Arthur Calwell for Chifley Labor government. Menzies continued that and expanded that. And he said when welcoming immigrants that we should treat every immigrant as a friend and make them feel welcome. And to me, that draws upon the Old Testament biblical ethic of welcoming the stranger. Also, if you look at Menzies' approach to foreign aid, he believed in granting a great deal of humanitarian assistance to the developing nations of the Southeast Asia Pacific, including Thailand and Vietnam and Malaysia. And he essentially justified that policy as Australia being a good neighbour in its region, and he actually used the term loving one's neighbour to describe Australia's position to support foreign aid to less fortunate and developing nations in our region. Also, his approach to education, no doubt, was informed by his faith. His groundbreaking policy was, of course, his decision from 1964 to grant state aid to Catholic and independent schools. It was a policy that attracted criticism from some quarters, even faith quarters, but he justified the decision on the basis that an education informed by faith provided the best foundation for cultivating the moral character of a rising generation. And so these were just a few policy areas that reflected his Christian values.
Yeah, there's quite a number of questions here relating to white Australia policy, immigration, people wondering how that sits with Menzies' faith. I think it's a very interesting question, and I'd like to come back to that in a later podcast or video, because maybe we'll bring in David Kemp to discuss this. He goes into this in his latest volume, his book on liberalism. It's a very important question, and I think we do need to consider it in more detail. There's also some questions here about universities. Number of questions. Well, one from Stuart Piggin here, who said, first of all, says, "Wonderful, David." Well, I think we all agree with that bit. What would Menzies think of the present government's university policy? But maybe we could draw out from that as well. Maybe you've got something to say on this, John. What would Menzies, as being really the father of modern higher education, great expansion in his era, he had a certain kind of education in mind. I wonder if universities turned out the way he would have hoped. Maybe you want to start with that, John.
I think it's a very good point. I would have loved to have talked about that earlier. I think if he had, to my way of thinking, if Menzies had a blind spot, it was probably in this area. He seemed to think that education would itself take us further down the road, if you like, of strengthening, of building, of taking forward what might have been called by his friend Churchill civilizational sort of Christianity. In reality, anything else, it's proved to be very, very different. The universities have been keenest of all, I think, to try and, or many of them, they don't even want Western civilization properly studied now because it's such a terrible thing. Menzies believed in Western civilization. The universities today don't, as we know, by and large. I mean, the number of courses taught, Tudor England, so profoundly important in the shaping of democracy. I don't think there's a single course on it in Australian university. I stand to be corrected. But so he'd have been dismayed. And I think it's very powerful evidence, as a matter of fact, that knowledge and wisdom and learning are not necessarily acquainted with one another.
There's a question here about, you might want to pick up on this too, John. It says it's from an anonymous contributor, but they ask this question, it's all very well having high Christian ideals, but in politics you run into many people who've more dubious character. How do you, I want you to speak to this as somebody of your long time in politics, how do you maintain your faith in politics, and how do you maintain the standards that the gospel demands of us in an environment that's often pretty rough and ready?
Well, you might have a few listeners who think that I failed on both tests. I'm neither a person of repute in a position to judge others or somebody who could maintain faith in others. But that's being flippant. It's a very good and important question. I think true Christianity always acknowledges the dual nature of man, what Pascal called the glory and the scum, and we both have, each of us has the potential to be both. I think Menzies was probably utterly realistic about human nature. But again, perhaps he may even have been a touch naive here. I don't know. I'm probably being unfair there. But I think he would have been, on balance, very realistic and recognised that we're all capable of doing the wrong thing and that many of his opponents behaved very badly. And that, as a very senior member of the parliament once said to me, don't think the enemy are over there, John. They're the opposition. Your enemies are the people behind you in your own ranks. So it's you just got to come to grips with the fact that a true Christian understanding recognises the worth and dignity of each. He was very strong on that, but that we're all flawed. We're all capable of doing the wrong thing. And I think the best approach is it's the old story, isn't it? Hope for the best and work for the best, but prepare for the worst, be utterly realistic. And I think he was probably a great master of that. But as we know, in later life, he became very disillusioned with the direction of Australian politics and society. And I think I'm right in saying, David will correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the very last formal speeches he gave, he was given the keys to the city of Frankston. And he gave a talk called to the effect that what Australia needs is a great outbreak of kindness, a great outbreaking of kindness. So he was constantly aware of failings, constantly, I think, to his great credit, looking to encourage people by trying to draw out their best.
David, you might like to add to that, but I'll just throw in a question before you do from Craig Schneider. How does Menzies' example give us the courage and wisdom to live out our faith in the public sphere? And maybe in that you might want to refer to something that we've spoken about, that in some ways you might say it was easier for Menzies than it would be for a politician today for this reason, that when Menzies retired in 1966, well over 90% of Australians would identify as being associated with the Christian faith. That number fell off very dramatically from the 1971 census onwards, but we now live in a very different world. So, David, can we draw from Menzies' example where we find the courage to talk about faith and talk about, I guess, matters of morality in that way in the public square?
Well, thank you, Craig. A great question. As Nick was saying, it is true that the times were perhaps kinder to Menzies than they would be to people of faith today, in that Menzies operated in a culture that was arguably more Christianized. And so talk about God and about scripture and about faith in general was more normative than it is today. So today, you know, we have a very secular culture. And I think it's true to say that in a lot of cases, people of faith have perhaps been their own worst enemies. We have a lot of self-censoring Christians and others of faith who are reticent to speak out about their faith for understandable reasons of not wanting to be ridiculed or maligned or as fanatics or fundamentalists or any other sort of pejorative term. But I think Christians and others of faith should be bolder in speaking out about their faith. And I think this is something we can learn from our American friends, where there's decidedly less inhibition for people in public life to speak about their faith. Yes, it's certainly true that Christians and others in America sometimes go about that the wrong way and sometimes do it for dubious reasons. But I think that their candor and boldness in speaking about faith is something that people of faith can learn from here in Australia.
Question from Greg Bonder. Another curly one. Greg gets to the heart of a complex issue here. So he writes, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So I guess the heart of Greg's question is this point, you know, do we serve God or mammon? Where that tension exists between what we consider our Christian duty and our duty to the authorities in our country and to the government. How often do those things come into tension in your experience, John, and how do you reconcile them?
I don't think they come into tension too much yet in this country. There's no full frontal attack on Christians per se, even though there are furious attempts, I think, to influence, for example, what happens in schools that's very hostile, and in academia. So it's not quite like the environment that Paul faced. It may deteriorate to that point. I think the interesting thing about Paul is that he wrote that's out of Romans, and yet he was in the end killed by the Romans for not submitting to their laws, by insisting that there was one God when they wanted to insist that there were many others and that Caesar was divine and what have you. So it's got to be interpreted against his evident belief that some things belong to Caesar, but not everything.
David, do you want to add to that?
Yes, well, of course, it's been a tension for Christians ever since Augustine wrote his City of God, where Christians, in one sense, are earthly citizens subject to their ruler in their country, but also they are citizens of heaven who are on a pilgrimage through earth. And of course, it goes right back to Jesus in the Gospels when he pulls out a denarius coin with Caesar's face on one side and says, render to God what is to God and render to Caesar what is to Caesar. And that's something that Christians have grappled with down the ages. And it's still something that causes consternation today when it comes to following civil authorities, where there may be a conflict in moral or spiritual areas of being a faithful Christian and being a good and dutiful citizen.
John, we live in an age of radical atheism. There was an attempt to lobby people to put down atheists on the census from people who think that religion should not have any place in public square. But here's the point. Robert Menzies was not the only Prime Minister to have a strong Christian faith. In fact, as far as I can tell, we've only ever had one Prime Minister, certainly in the post-war period, who was courageous enough, and I use that word genuinely, to stand up and say that she didn't have a Christian faith, or didn't have it. She was an atheist, and that was Julia Gillard. But we elect Christian Prime Minister after Christian Prime Minister, various different kinds of Christianity, some more observant than others, including, but of course, a fine example in our latest Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. Why is that? Is that just a coincidence, or do you think that there's something in people with a moral framework that comes from the Bible that makes them more trustworthy and more electable?
I think I'd certainly say they tend to be more service-oriented. And, you know, our culture inculcates in our children the idea that they're the centre of not perhaps their own universe so much as the universe, where there are all these little sort of centres of universe wandering around the place, and rather than service. And we hate that when we see it in our leaders. We say, hang on, we don't want it to be about you. You're there to serve us. And so I do think that when Christians, out of that sort of deep sense of responsibility to others, that Menzies plainly, really was at the heart of the man, I think that's picked up by Australians who are very good at picking up authenticity. Now, the other thing about it that ought to be noted is that it was assumed that secularism would win out. What has now come to be understood as secularism, that people, as they became more sophisticated, moved up the living standard chain, better educated, would drop away from faith globally. That's not happened. It's a Western phenomenon only. And in fact, most Western countries have declining populations. This is an age of great ferment and interest over and about faith and what people believe and what philosophies they will follow. And so, it's a very good idea, I think, that we understand the foundations of our own system. I mean, I just cite again, 180 or 190 countries in the world, 40 democracies, 36 of them plainly, of Christian origin. All those that democratic tradition is Christian origin, and the 4 that are not. That's where it came from. I can only say it again, we should be very careful what we wish for. And again, as I look around at the fracturing and the breaking up, at the loneliness, the anxiety, we're almost cowering in a corner, fearful of the world around us in the West today. And so I think there's a polite question to be asked for people who say more of this secularism, more of this atheism, more of this sort of technocratically run world where the technocrats know best and we just follow their advice. How's it really working out, chaps? I'm not so sure it's such a convincing story. Maybe we need to go back to ask some foundational questions again and drop this idea that all wisdom resides in the current age. See, there's this argument over, was Menzies really a conservative? Well, he knew his history. He knew that human beings had, over the ages, put an immense amount of thought into the great questions of life, the conundrum of good and evil and what have you. He knew that we were the inheritors of a great tradition and of great wisdom down through the ages. He would have been aghast at our insistence that no one who's gone before us knew anything. And that's why this book's so valuable. You can dive in, and even if you come out of the other end saying, I don't agree with this, you'll know a lot more.
Thank you, John. Thank you, David. And look, I genuinely want to thank everybody who's joined this webinar tonight. You may feel that it's all rather distant, but we'd love to, as David said, have you in the same room, and we will be doing some live events around this just as soon as we can. But it gives a tremendous heart to see that hundreds of people not only registered for tonight's session, but have actually sat through and listened attentively and sent in questions. There seems to be a great interest and hunger for more on this subject. My recent interview with Greg Sheridan about his book Christians is one of our most successful podcasts, certainly this year. If you want to find out why, you can go and listen to it on podcast or on our YouTube channel. There is tremendous interest in this, as seen tonight. It's a very important subject. We've got a very important debate coming up on freedom of religion and how we can pass legislation which might bolster that. So we'll be doing a lot more on this subject. We also want to get David's book talked about. So if anybody here watching tonight would like to talk to us about getting David or myself or to come out and come and do a session with your local group, we'd love to hear from you. Just as soon as we can get out of lockdown, we'll be out and about with this book because we want to talk about it more. What else can I say? John Anderson also has a very good interview with Greg Sheridan too. And don't forget John Anderson's Conversations, essential listening or viewing, depending on how you like to consume it. So I'd just like to say once again, thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody who's been involved in tonight's proceedings. Alex Bennett for producing the technical side of things. To my team at the Menzies Research Centre, James Matthias, to Susan Ewan, and Tim James. Particular thanks to Tim for the effort that he's put in, not just to organising tonight, but into getting this book through. It's been a labour of love, I suspect, for Tim, as much as it has for David. Thank you again, everybody who's played a part in this book. And please stay tuned. We'll be back to talk more about this and other subjects in the near future.